Yokohama General Hospital stood eerily silent in the dim light of the early evening. The old, concrete building, stained with years of weathering, loomed against the darkening sky. The air was thick with humidity, making every breath feel heavy. The faint sounds of cicadas echoed in the distance, their chorus growing louder as the sun dipped below the horizon. Inside, the hospital was a maze of sterile corridors and empty rooms, the linoleum floors reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. The smell of antiseptic was omnipresent, mingling with the faint, musty odor of age. Dr. Haruto Takahashi, a seasoned surgeon in his late 40s, was finishing his rounds. He walked with a deliberate pace, his footsteps echoing through the deserted halls. His mind was preoccupied with thoughts of the strange occurrences reported by the night staff, whispers of phantom patients, unexplained cold spots, and the distant sound of footsteps in empty corridors had become a common topic of conversation among the staff. Haruto had always dismissed these stories as the result of overactive imagination and the stress of working long hours. As he approached the end of his shift, Haruto decided to check on one last patient in room 307, an elderly woman named Miss Nakamura. She had been admitted for a minor surgery and was expected to be discharged the next morning. Haruto opened the door to her room, finding her asleep. The soft beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. Satisfied, he quietly closed the door and turned to leave. As he walked down the corridor towards the elevator, Haruto felt a sudden chill run down his spine. The temperature seemed to drop dramatically, and he could see his breath misting in the cold air. He stopped in his tracks, looking around for the source of the chill. The hallway was empty, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Haruto shook his head, dismissing the sensation as fatigue. He continued towards the elevator, eager to leave the hospital and the strange occurrences behind. As he waited for the elevator doors to open, Haruto heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, expecting to see a nurse or another doctor. But the corridor was empty. The footsteps grew louder, echoing off the walls, yet there was no one in sight. A cold sweat broke out on Haruto's forehead as he stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the ground floor. The doors closed with a soft whoosh, and the elevator began its descent. Haruto leaned against the wall, trying to steady his breathing. The elevator's gentle hum
was interrupted by a sudden jolt, and the lights flickered.
The elevator came to an abrupt stop between floors, and the emergency lights cast an eerie glow over the small space. Haruto pressed the emergency button, his heart pounding in his chest. A static-filled voice crackled over the intercom. "Maintenance will be here shortly. Please remain calm." Haruto closed his eyes, taking deep breaths to calm himself. The minutes ticked by slowly, each second feeling like an eternity. Suddenly, the temperature in the elevator plummeted, and Haruto could see his breath once more. A low whisper filled the air, indistinct and haunting. He opened his eyes and saw a faint figure, standing in the corner of the elevator. The figure was translucent, barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth moving as if she were trying to speak. Haruto's heart raced as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. The figure reached out towards him, her hand passing through his arm like mist. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, but Haruto couldn't understand the words. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, and the elevator resumed its descent. Haruto stumbled out of the elevator on the ground floor, his legs trembling. He hurried to his office, locking the door behind him. He sank into his chair, his mind racing with thoughts of what he had just experienced. The logical part of his mind tried to rationalize it as a hallucination brought on by fatigue, but a deeper, primal part of him knew that what he had seen was real. Over the next few days, Haruto couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. He began to research the history of the hospital, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. What he found only deepened the mystery. Yokohama General had been built on the site of an old tuberculosis sanatorium that had been closed down in the early 20th century. The sanatorium had been known for its high mortality rate and was rumored to be haunted by the spirits of those who had died there. Haruto's curiosity grew as he delved deeper into the hospital's past. He discovered records of numerous unexplained deaths and disappearances over the years, many of which had been attributed to natural causes or accidents. But the more he read, the more he became convinced that there was something more sinister at work. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Haruto enlisted the help of his colleague, Yumi Sato, a neurologist with an interest in the paranormal. Yumi was skeptical at first, but as Haruto recounted his experiences, she began to take his concerns seriously. Together, they decided to investigate the hospital after hours. Hoping to find some evidence of the supernatural, they started their investigation in the old wing of the hospital, which had been closed off for renovations. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from their flashlights, casting long shadows on the walls. As they walked through the darkened corridors, they heard the faint sound of footsteps behind them. They turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. The temperature dropped suddenly, and their breath misted in the cold air. A low whisper filled the air, growing louder and more urgent. Yumi's flashlight flickered, and they saw a figure standing at the end of the corridor. It was the same woman Haruto had seen in the elevator. Her eyes wide with terror, she reached out towards them, her hand passing through the air like mist. Haruto and Yumi stood frozen in place, their hearts pounding in their chests. The figure began to move towards them, her mouth moving as if she were trying to speak. As she got closer, the whispering grew louder, and they could finally make out the words, "Help me, find peace." The figure reached out towards Haruto, her hand passing through his chest. A wave of cold washed over him, and he felt a sudden sense of despair. The figure vanished, and the temperature returned to normal. Haruto and Yumi stood in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. They knew that they had to find out more about the woman and what had happened to her. They spent the next few days poring over old records and talking to the hospital staff. They discovered that the woman was a nurse named Aiko, who had worked at the sanatorium. She had been known for her kindness and dedication to her patients. But one night, she had disappeared without a trace, and her body was never found. The staff had whispered that her spirit still lingered, searching for peace. Haruto and Yumi realized that they needed to find Aiko's remains and give her a proper burial to put her spirit to rest. They continued their investigation, following leads and interviewing anyone who might have information about Aiko's disappearance. Their search led them to an old storage room in the basement of the hospital. The room was filled with forgotten medical equipment and old files. As they searched through the clutter, they found a hidden door leading to a small, dark room. Inside, they found Aiko's remains, her bones, carefully arranged on a makeshift altar. A sense of sadness and despair filled the room, and they knew that they had found the source of the haunting. They carefully collected Aiko's remains and took them to a nearby shrine, where they arranged for a proper burial. As they laid her to rest, they felt a sense of peace wash over them. The haunting at Yokohama General stopped, and the hospital returned to normal. But Haruto and Yumi knew that they would never forget the experience. The memory of Aiko's haunted eyes and the cold touch of her spirit would stay with them forever, a reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. Yokohama General Hospital stood as a testament to the past, its halls now silent and free of the whispers of the forgotten. But for those who knew the truth, the hospital would always be a place of mystery and intrigue, a place where the echoes of the past could still be heard in the quiet of the night. The sun had set, casting long, eerie shadows across the quiet streets surrounding Yokohama General Hospital. Haruto and Yumi had returned to their respective homes, but the events of the previous night haunted their thoughts. Sleep came fitfully to both, as images of the spectral nurse and her desperate plea for peace lingered in their minds. The next morning, Haruto arrived at the hospital early. Determined to find more answers, he met Yumi in the staff lounge, where they discussed their next steps over a quick breakfast. "We need to find out more about Eiko's life," Yumi suggested, her voice tinged with urgency. "There must be someone who remembers her, someone who can give us more context." Haruto nodded in agreement, his mind already racing with possibilities. "I'll check the hospital archives again. Maybe there's something we missed." Yumi offered to speak with some of the older staff members, hoping to uncover any memories or rumors that might shed light on Eiko's tragic fate. The hospital's archives were housed in a dimly lit room in the basement, filled with shelves of dusty records and files. Haruto spent hours sifting through old documents, his fingers growing numb from the cold. Finally, he came across a file labeled Nakamura Eiko. Inside, he found her personal records, along with a few handwritten notes. Eiko had been well liked by her colleagues and patients alike, known for her compassion and dedication. But there were also whispers of her involvement in a scandal, something that had been quietly covered up. Haruto's heart quickened as he read the notes, sensing that he was on the verge of a breakthrough. Meanwhile, Yumi had been speaking with some of the older nurses who had worked at the hospital for decades. They recalled Eiko with fondness, but were hesitant to speak about her disappearance. One nurse, Mrs. Tanaka, finally relented and shared a chilling story. "Eiko was a kind soul," Mrs. Tanaka began, her voice trembling slightly. "But she got involved with a patient, a man who was terminally ill. It was against hospital policy, and there were rumors that they were planning to run away together."
Yumi listened intently, feeling a sense of dread settle over her.
"One night, she just vanished. Some say she was taken by the spirits of the sanatorium. Others believe she met with foul play." Mrs. Tanaka paused, her eyes filled with sorrow. "But whatever happened, it was covered up. The hospital couldn't afford a scandal." Yumi thanked Mrs. Tanaka for her time and rushed to find Haruto. When she shared what she had learned, Haruto's expression grew grim. "A cover-up," he muttered, his mind racing.
If that's true, then Eiko's spirit
"Won't find peace until the truth is uncovered." Together, they decided to confront the hospital's administration, hoping to find someone who could corroborate Mrs. Tanaka's story. Dr. Kenjiro Ito, the hospital director, was a stern man in his 60s, with a reputation for being unapproachable. But Haruto and Yumi knew they had no choice. They presented their findings to Dr. Ito, who listened with a stony expression. When they finished, he let out a long sigh. "I had hoped this would remain buried," he said quietly. "But you are right. The truth must come out." Dr. Ito revealed that Eiko's disappearance had been hushed up to protect the hospital's reputation. She had indeed been involved with a patient, and there had been plans to elope. But the patient had died unexpectedly, and in her grief, Eiko had disappeared. There were suspicions that she had been driven to despair and taken her own life, but her body was never found.
Haruto and Yumi felt a mixture of sadness and anger.
The cover-up had prevented Eiko's spirit from finding peace, and they knew they had to rectify the wrong. They requested Dr. Ito's permission to conduct a formal investigation, hoping to uncover any remaining evidence. Reluctantly, he agreed. As they delved deeper into the hospital's past, Haruto and Yumi uncovered more disturbing details. There were inconsistencies in the patient records, and several staff members who had worked at the hospital during Eiko's time had either retired or left under mysterious circumstances. They began to suspect that Eiko's disappearance was not a simple case of heartbreak and despair. The investigation led them to an old storage room in the basement, where they found a hidden drawer filled with old photographs and letters. Among them was a letter addressed to Eiko from the patient she had been involved with, a man named Hiroshi. The letter spoke of their plans to escape together and start a new life, but it also hinted at something more sinister. "We need to find out who." The investigation took on a new urgency. as they sought to uncover the identity of the person who had threatened Hiroshi and Eiko. They interviewed more staff members, carefully piecing together the events leading up to Eiko's disappearance. One name kept coming up in their interviews: Dr. Sato, a senior physician who had retired shortly after Eiko vanished. Dr. Sato had been known for his strict adherence to hospital policy and his disdain for anything that might tarnish the institution's reputation. Haruto and Yumi decided to visit Dr. Sato at his home, hoping to finally get some answers. Dr. Sato lived in a small, well-kept house on the outskirts of Yokohama. He greeted them with a polite but guarded demeanor, clearly uncomfortable with their questions. When they mentioned Eiko's name, his expression darkened. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said curtly. "Eiko's disappearance was a tragedy, but I had nothing to do with it." Haruto and Yumi exchanged a glance, sensing that Dr. Sato was hiding something. "Dr. Sato," Haruto began, his voice calm but firm, "we have reason to believe that Eiko and Hiroshi were threatened by someone at the hospital. We need to know the truth." For a moment, Dr. Sato remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. Then, with a heavy sigh, he looked up at them. "I tried to protect the hospital," he said quietly. "When I found out about Eiko and Hiroshi, I warned them to end their relationship. It was against policy, and it would have caused a scandal. But Hiroshi was determined to leave with Eiko. He said he didn't care about the consequences. I couldn't let that happen." Dr. Sato's voice trembled as he continued. "I confronted Hiroshi that night, trying to convince him to stay. We argued, and he fell. It was an accident, but I panicked. I knew that if anyone found out, it would ruin the hospital. So I covered it up." Haruto and Yumi listened in stunned silence as Dr. Sato recounted the events of that fateful night. When Eiko found out, she was devastated. She blamed herself for Hiroshi's death and she disappeared. "I never saw her again." Dr. Sato's eyes were filled with regret and sorrow. "I've lived with this guilt for years. I thought I was protecting the hospital, but I was wrong." Haruto and Yumi knew that they had finally uncovered the truth. Eiko's spirit had been restless because the truth had been buried for so long. With Dr. Sato's confession, they had the final piece of the puzzle. They returned to the hospital and shared their findings with Dr. Ito, who agreed to make a public statement, acknowledging the cover-up and apologizing to Eiko's family. A memorial service was held for Eiko and Hiroshi, giving them the recognition they had been denied for so long. As the ceremony concluded, Haruto and Yumi felt a sense of peace. They knew that Eiko's spirit had finally found rest. The haunting at Yokohama General ceased, and the hospital began to heal from the wounds of the past. Haruto and Yumi's bond grew stronger through their shared experience, and they continued to work together. Driven by a newfound sense of purpose, the shadows that had once loomed over the hospital were finally dispelled, leaving behind a legacy of truth and redemption. The late autumn air had turned crisp, a stark contrast to the oppressive humidity of summer. The trees surrounding Yokohama General Hospital had begun to shed their leaves, blanketing the ground in a patchwork of red and gold. The hospital, once a beacon of bustling activity, now seemed to exude a solemn stillness, as if it too was mourning the secrets it had kept hidden for so long. Haruto and Yumi stood together at the edge of the hospital grounds, watching as the memorial service for Eiko and Hiroshi concluded. The ceremony had been a small but poignant affair, attended by a few staff members and relatives of the deceased. As the last of the attendees departed, leaving only the two doctors behind, a sense of quiet resolve settled over them. "We did the right thing," Yumi said softly, her breath visible in the cold air. Haruto nodded, but his mind was still restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover, something deeper, that they had yet to find. "We need to keep investigating," he said, turning to Yumi. "There are still too many unanswered questions." If Dr. Sato was willing to cover up one death,
Who knows what else might have been hidden?
Yumi agreed, her expression determined. We should start by looking into the other disappearances. There might be a pattern we're missing. Their investigation resumed with a renewed sense of urgency. They began by examining the hospital's old records once more, looking for any mention of unexplained deaths or disappearances that had occurred around the same time as Aiko's. To their dismay, they found several instances where patients had vanished without a trace, their cases quietly closed with little to no explanation. The pattern was clear: each disappearance had been swiftly covered up, the records altered or incomplete. One name, in particular, stood out to them: Taro Suzuki, a young intern who had disappeared a few months before Aiko. There were whispers among the staff that Taro had been involved in something shady.
But the details were murky.
Haruto and Yumi decided to track down Taro's family, hoping to find more information. They visited his parents, who lived in a modest home in a quiet neighborhood. Taro's mother, Mrs. Suzuki, greeted them with a mix of hope and fear. "We've been waiting for years for someone to tell us what happened to our son," she said, her voice trembling.
Haruto and Yumi explained their investigation, and Mrs.
Suzuki led them to Taro's old room. It was a time capsule, left untouched since his disappearance. As they sifted through his belongings, they found a journal hidden beneath a stack of medical textbooks. The journal was filled with detailed notes about the hospital. But one entry caught their attention. Taro had written about his suspicions of unethical practices within the hospital, mentioning a shadowy figure who seemed to be orchestrating the cover-ups. The name was smudged, but the initials AM.K were legible.
Haruto and Yumi exchanged a glance, their minds racing.
They thanked Mrs. Suzuki and promised to keep her informed of their findings. Back at the hospital, they began to discreetly ask around about the initials AM.K. It wasn't long before they uncovered the name Masato Kimura, a former head of surgery who had retired under mysterious circumstances. Kimura had been known for his ruthlessness and his unwavering dedication to the hospital's reputation. Haruto and Yumi decided to visit Kimura at his home, hoping to confront him about his involvement in the cover-ups.
Kimura lived in an imposing mansion on the outskirts of the city,
a stark contrast to the modest homes of the other retired doctors they had visited. He greeted them with a cold, calculating gaze, his eyes betraying no emotion. "What brings you here?" he asked, his voice smooth, but with an underlying hint of menace. Haruto didn't mince words. "We're investigating the disappearances of several patients and staff members from Yokohama General. We believe you were involved." Kimura's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said dismissively. Yumi stepped forward, her voice firm. "We found Taro Suzuki's journal. He mentioned you by name." Kimura's facade cracked for a moment, a flicker of fear passing across his face. Then, with a resigned sigh, he gestured for them to sit. "It seems you've uncovered more than I expected," he said, his tone resigned. "But you need to understand, everything I did was for the good of the hospital. There were things that needed to be kept quiet for the sake of everyone involved." Haruto felt a surge of anger. "People died, Kimura. Innocent people. How can you justify that?" Kimura looked away, his face etched with regret. "I didn't have a choice," he said quietly. "There were powerful people involved. People who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. I was just a pawn in their game." Yumi's voice was filled with disgust. "And what about Aiko and Hiroshi? They were just pawns too." Kimura's eyes filled with sadness. "Aiko was a good nurse, and Hiroshi, he was my friend. I never wanted things to end the way they did. But once Hiroshi started digging into the hospital's past, I knew it was only a matter of time before he uncovered something that would get us all killed." Haruto and Yumi listened in stunned silence as Kimura recounted the events that had led to the cover-ups. Hiroshi had stumbled upon evidence of illegal experiments being conducted on patients, experiments that had been sanctioned by powerful figures within the medical community. When he tried to expose the truth, he was silenced. Aiko had been caught in the crossfire, her love for Hiroshi sealing her fate. Kimura had been forced to cover up their deaths to protect his own life and the lives of his colleagues. The more Kimura spoke, the more Haruto and Yumi realized the depth of the corruption that had plagued the hospital for decades. They knew that they had to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. With Kimura's reluctant cooperation, they gathered the evidence. They needed to expose the illegal experiments and the cover-ups. They presented their findings to the authorities, who launched a full-scale investigation into the hospital. The revelation sent shockwaves through the medical community, leading to the arrest of several high-ranking officials and the closure of the hospital's old wing. Yokohama General was forced to confront its dark past, but with the truth finally out in the open, the hospital began to rebuild its reputation. Haruto and Yumi felt a sense of vindication as they watched the hospital undergo its transformation. They had uncovered the secrets that had been buried for so long, bringing justice to those who had suffered, but the journey had taken its toll on them, both physically and emotionally. As they stood together in the hospital courtyard, watching the sunset, Haruto turned to Yumi. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and exhaustion. Yumi nodded, her eyes reflecting the same weariness. But at what cost? So many lives were lost, so much pain endured. Haruto placed a hand on her shoulder. "We can't change the past, but we can honor their memory by ensuring that nothing like this ever happens again." Yumi smiled faintly, her resolve renewed. "You're right. We'll make sure their stories are never forgotten." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Haruto and Yumi felt a sense of closure. The haunting had ended, but the echoes of the past would always remain. A reminder of the darkness that had once shrouded Yokohama General. They knew that they had made a difference, and that knowledge gave them the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they would continue to fight for the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. The secrets of the hospital had been unearthed, but their journey was far from over. Haruto and Yumi knew that as long as there were shadows to be unraveled, their work would never truly be done. The first light of dawn cast a pale glow over Yokohama General Hospital, illuminating the freshly cleaned corridors and the new plaques commemorating the lives lost to the hospital's dark past. The air was crisp with the promise of a new beginning, yet the weight of history lingered like a ghost in the corners. Haruto stood by the memorial, his breath visible in the chilly morning air, contemplating the journey that had led them here. Beside him, Yumi silently placed a white chrysanthemum on the stone, a symbol of mourning and peace. The investigation had finally uncovered the truth, bringing closure to the haunting mysteries that had plagued the hospital. But there was one final task left to complete. "We need to find Aiko's final resting place," Yumi said, her voice soft yet resolute. Haruto nodded, knowing that this was the key to ensuring that Aiko's spirit could finally find peace. The records had revealed that Aiko's remains had been hastily buried in an unmarked grave near the old sanatorium grounds, now overgrown and forgotten.
Haruto and Yumi made their way to the site.
The crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound in the early morning stillness. The path led them through a dense thicket of trees, the shadows playing tricks on their eyes as they moved deeper into the forest. The sense of unease grew with each step, but they pressed on, determined to complete their mission. Finally, they reached a small clearing where a single, weathered stone marker stood, barely visible amidst the underbrush. "This must be it," Haruto said, kneeling to brush away the leaves and dirt that had accumulated over the years. Yumi joined him, her hands trembling as she worked to reveal the inscription. As they cleared the marker, a sudden chill enveloped them, and the air grew heavy with an unnatural silence. They exchanged a glance, their breath coming in short, visible puffs. "We should hurry," Haruto said, his voice barely above a whisper. Together, they began to dig, the cold earth resisting their efforts. The silence was broken only by the sound of their shovels striking the ground and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As they dug deeper, the chill intensified, and Haruto could feel the presence of something watching them. After what felt like hours, their shovels struck something solid. They cleared away the remaining earth to reveal a simple, wooden box, weathered and fragile. Yumi knelt beside it, her fingers tracing the edges with reverence. "This is it," she said softly. "We've found her." They carefully lifted the box from the ground, its weight a solemn reminder of the life it contained. With great care, they carried the box back to the hospital grounds, where a proper burial had been arranged. A small gathering of hospital staff and local residents had assembled, their faces somber but hopeful. The ceremony was brief but poignant, with prayers and words of remembrance spoken for Aiko and Hiroshi.
As the box was lowered into the ground, Haruto and Yumi felt a sense of peace wash over them.
As if a great burden had finally been lifted, the haunting presence that had plagued the hospital seemed to dissipate, replaced by a calm serenity. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Yokohama General began to change. The staff moved through their routines with a newfound sense of purpose, and the patients felt the shift in the air. The hospital, once shrouded in shadows, was now a place of healing and hope. Haruto and Yumi continued their work, their bond strengthened by the trials they had faced together. They knew that their journey was far from over, but they faced the future with a renewed sense of determination. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, Haruto and Yumi stood together on the rooftop of the hospital, looking out over the city. The skyline was dotted with lights, the hum of life below, a comforting reminder of the world they had fought to protect. "We did it," Yumi said, her voice filled with quiet satisfaction. Haruto nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We did, and we'll keep doing it for as long as we can." Yumi smiled, a rare moment of lightness in the midst of their somber work. "Together," she said, and Haruto echoed her sentiment. Together, as they stood there, side by side. The first stars began to appear in the twilight sky. The hospital below was a testament to their perseverance, a symbol of the power of truth and the strength of the human spirit. And though the shadows of the past would never be completely erased, they knew that they had made a difference, for Aiko, for Hiroshi, and for all those who had suffered in silence. Their stories would never be forgotten, and their spirits would finally rest in peace. Haruto and Yumi turned to leave the rooftop, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The future was uncertain, but they knew that, as long as they stood together, they could overcome anything. As they descended the stairs, their footsteps echoing softly in the quiet building, the first light of a new day began to break over Yokohama General Hospital, heralding a brighter future for all who walked its halls.